Okay, hello, welcome back to Land Rover Toolbox videos. Last week I give you a little heads up on checking the bolt and making sure it turns before you attempt to undo the nut. This will give you an indication whether you have to take a little bit more aggressive action. On the rear here we have a bolt that's stiff. What I'm doing is winding the bolt out and using the nut to hold it. This way it will move it and crack off any rust. And you can see here that it is quite rusty, so it's a matter of tapping it backwards and forwards and shifting the corrosion out of it so you can get the bolt clearly out of the bracket. Okay, so like that. The other thing is also, as these bolts, you don't get the access on one side to use a hammer properly to knock the bolt out, so you have to work here. Good one here is to use some oil as well, lubricate it. This will help it slip out. Once it's out, you're free to move your arm or your suspension component. Right, okay, well we fitted our poly bushes. Doesn't matter whether you have OEM bushes or poly bushes fitted, but what we have here is some nice shiny new bushes that are not worn at all. This is the front radius arm, and on the rear end we have two bushes which don't need pressing in, they're just a hand fit. So what we're going to be doing is fitting the suspension components back, or I'll be giving you a heads up anyway. First of all, we're going to fit the radius arm, this bush, just very loosely and put the nut on loosely. This will give us enough leverage then to be able to put the radius arm into place. Remembering that the axle already has moved, it's just natural when you take this off. And using a bar, you can move the radius arm about, so you can square it up so the holes are lined up, and then you can push your bolt through. Yes, this can be a bit awkward, and what I'm advising here is to fit both radius arms and put the rear of the axle bolts in first. Alright, now it can be a little bit of a struggle, or this one was. Once it's in, you want to do the other side as well. Once you've done that, you can then use a bottle jack to jack up the radius arm. You notice I've got axle stands under the axle as well, and the chassis is supported further at the back there. So you have the bottle jack, which is helping you. The only way that the radius arm and the bush can go is upwards and almost square, like so. Okay, so you can see the eye of the bush and the bracket, line them up, and then you can use a tool or a bolt just to make sure that it will fit through. Do not hammer the bolt through if you can help it, because this will damage the threads. I'm using a little bit of ceramic spray here, just as an anti-corrosion agent. You could use copper slip or oil. Now, I know that the thread is all the way through, so I can gently tap it the rest of the way home. So what we have is the radius arm just loosely secured now. We'll later do the nuts and the bolts up. Right, so on the other side, I'm just gently tapping the bolt and it will not go through. What you might find is that it's just slightly angled, so using a bar you can then level it out so it will slip in easily. Remember what I said, you don't want to be damaging the threads too much. So if I wiggle it about a little bit of pressure on it, okay, and yeah, that's gone through. Now you notice the threads are not damaged there, so I can screw the nut on without a struggle. These radius arm bolts, 2-axle, are actually very tight. They're something like 170 odd Newton meters. And what I'd advise is a couple of ways of doing this is nip them up first and then torque them later. Remember that we took the track rod off, that can go back on and be torqued up. That's 40 Newton meters on those nuts there to secure the taper. We also have here our panhard rod, which only goes on one way. You can see the curve in the panhard rod actually goes and shapes around the diff pan, so you can't really get that wrong. The lower suspension link, or the tie rod for the rear axle, has a bush here which is on a plate. Now what I've done here is left it loose before I fit the other end to the axle. There's a good reason for this. If you tighten it up, you won't be able to get this back on the axle. So first of all, what I'm going to do is use an old bolt or a screwdriver just to square up the holes. Remember, never put your finger in a hole, otherwise you could end up losing half of it. Right, so we're going to use a brand new bolt. These are all imperial sizes, and I'm also going to drop some engine oil on there, or lubricant, which will stop this from seizing up. Okay, this is on the back axle, so it's going to get a fair bit of water pushed in there on wet days. Right, so we're going to leave these relatively loose at the moment. The bush up here on the bracket is held on by 3 M10 bolts, and you should be able to find the torque setting in any workshop manual. And then it's a matter of doing this nut up. Now I thread lock this because we're using old nuts. However, this is not going to be done up to its correct torque yet. First of all, just pull it up, alright? And as you can see, it's pulling into the bush. It should come to a dead stop, and then after then we can torque it up. In the workshop manual, stated by Land Rover, what they require us to do is to lower the vehicle with the wheels on and take it up in a static position before we tighten up the link to chassis. Okay, so it says lower vehicle, allow axle to take up static laden position and fully tighten link chassis fixing to 176 Newton meters. That's the large bush with the bracket on it. The reason for this is because the way bushes flex, we do not want to have it giving us handling problems or having the bushes fail prematurely. This is why they state this. As a locking device, we've thread locked this nut. To make things a bit easier and accessible, the wheels have been taken off so we can access the nuts and bolts without having to crawl on our bellies under the vehicle. So you can see this quite clearly. The weight of the vehicle is on the suspension and the axles. This vehicle is not laden, however. The top link mounting bracket to the cross member is 47 Newton meters, and these are M10 bolts, and the bolt itself is 176 Newton meters. Now what I'd advise is not to fit this bolt here until you've done up this shackle pin. Basically, it's very awkward to get at, and I can't show you tightening it up with a camera pointed upwards, so just take it as gospel. This is what you need to do. Right, well I found the torque setting for the ball joint to bracket, which is 176 Newton meters, and unfortunately the nuts for the bracket to axle I couldn't find at the moment. These bolts here, which is on the pivot bracket and the upper link arms, these are tightened to 176 Newton meters, so we'll take this as Land Rover's data is correct. Panhard rod bolts are 88 Newton meters, so make sure you torque both of these up. There is a train of thought which says that with issues regarding handling, it's because the suspension has been torqued up with no weight on the suspension. However, in the manual, Land Rover do not state that the wheel should be put on and then the bolts torqued up. In fact, it's the other way around if you read this section from the workshop manual for the 300 TDI. So basically it comes down to you and what you decide to do. Radius arm to axle fixings are 197 Newton meters, and radius arm to chassis on the front is 176 Newton meters.